Hi, this is Joe Kwon, the Connection Counselor. Have you ever been in a setting, let's say a meeting or a conference or even a party, where it just seemed like there were no interesting people around? Like you were just bored out of your mind and you just wish you could be anywhere but where you are right now, but for whatever reason you weren't at liberty to leave and exit stage left. Well, today we're going to go over the principle about why that might happen, and more importantly, what you can do to ensure that that never happens again, as well as to create a situation where you will be the most interesting person in the room or the most interesting person to the person that you're talking to, regardless of the setting or who that person is, how to just become the most fascinating, interesting person to that person. So if that sounds good, stay tuned for this next episode of the Charisma Chronicles. Charisma Chronicles, Episode 4, The Curiosity Connection. So what does it mean to be curious? And how is that helpful to get you more charisma, or as we talked about in the intro, to make other people more interesting, as well as for yourself to seem like the most interesting person in the room to the person you're talking to? I think it's important to understand why you might not be curious, because within that lies the key or the underlying principle for why curiosity is so powerful as a principle. So the enemy of curiosity is knowing, right? Knowing, or let's say apparent knowing. So you think you know everything you need to know, so you're not curious about it, right? So let's say you walk into a car dealership and you have studied everything you need to know about the car, from the colors, the options, the mechanics of it, and you walk in and you don't want to hear anything from the salesperson because you're not curious. You're like, what could this guy or gal have to tell me that I haven't figured out, right? You don't want to hear anything about this. You say, this is the deal that I want, and that's it. I'm not gonna pay a penny more. And the salesperson looks at you and says, wow, you really know what you're doing. You have a deal, sir, or you have a deal, ma'am. And they proceed to sell you the car like $2,000 or $3,000 more than you could have gotten it for, because if you let them talk and if you explored a little bit more, you could find out that the exact car that you wanted, they had one that had special financing, so you got $3,000 off, or someone had just returned the exact car that you wanted and it wouldn't be brand new, but it would be like a day old and you could get it at a significant discount. But because you knew everything and you weren't curious, you didn't give the other person an opportunity to share. And that's kind of the thing that happens when we enter a situation and we think we just know people. Like, we know what this person's about, we know what this situation is about, and what we basically do is we cut ourselves off from really interesting and valuable information. And I'm not talking about value from like, okay, I'm going to get money. I'm talking about value from like, human beings are supremely interesting people. They have wonderful stories and backstories that you will never know unless people trust you and that comes out. So how do you generate that trust, right? I mean, normally you walk into a situation and someone's not going to tell you their life story right away. I mean, probably you don't want that because that's a little bit socially awkward, right? But if you show curiosity and you start to develop rapport and trust, you can find out incredible things and you can learn amazing things about someone who on the surface you thought you had them pegged. You're like, you're just type B from this area of the country. These are your opinions, blah, blah, blah. I know exactly what you're going to say. and you didn't realize that this person is actually much deeper and more complex than you thought. And that is really the power of curiosity. When you don't assume that you know everything about a person, it makes you naturally more curious. And when you're naturally more curious, you start to ask more questions, you start to explore, and really interesting stuff comes back out. So that's why that person will seem much more interesting to you if you give them the opportunity to reveal about themselves. And that only happens if you're curious and sincerely curious. And people can sense that, right? People can sense the fake curiosity. They know the difference between how are you doing, what's up, which is really a rhetorical, question or a social nicety versus, how are you doing? You seem a little bit off today, is there anything I can do? How are you feeling? Right? Is everything okay? People can tell when that comes from the heart versus when it's just something you're saying as lip service or because it's the right thing to say. And people will react differently based on what they feel. Even if they don't mentally make a note, they will respond and react according to how they feel emotionally about the words that are coming out of your mouth. The other thing that's really powerful about curiosity is when you are curious about someone else, this really odd thing happens. I mean, I've noticed this in my interactions with people after I've started trying to, be intentionally more curious with people. They actually look at you differently. Like, it's funny because you're being more curious about them, but you get back this look where they're really curious about you. And even if they're not asking you a lot about yourself, even if it is kind of, more one way and, you're listening and you're finding more about their story, they look at you like, wow, you're such an interesting person. And I don't know if it's because normally people don't take the time or don't really exhibit this caring, but it definitely happens that when you are more curious about someone, they automatically become more curious about you. And the big joke, right, is, when people give advice about interviewing, a lot of times you'll see people writing comments like, the best interview I ever had was, the interview talked all about themselves. And I got hired and they told me like what a great interview I had at the end. And you're like, I didn't say anything. I just asked you some questions and you talked about how great your career was here at the company. Exactly. So, not saying that that's what you should do, but it does exhibit the principles at play that curiosity is really powerful both in the way you perceive people as well as the way they perceive you. So now we're going to head into the next section of the Charisma Chronicles, one of my favorites, which is the Charisma Corner with my good friend Sarah Elkins. And Sarah will always have a special place in my heart because her podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, But How You Tell Them Will, was the first podcast I ever went on. And, at the time I was kind of noodling, maybe I want to do a podcast because I was doing a lot of writing, but I wanted to do something a little bit more interactive and more creative in that sense in terms of the, audio visual. And Sarah had asked me to go on her show and I just had a blast. And then so I kind of put one toe in the water and I was like, I kind of want to do this. And then she was kind enough. I asked her after the podcast, so Sarah, tell me how you got into podcasting. Was it difficult? What's some of the software you use and how do you edit it? And she was just so generous with her time and she shared with me and it really inspired me. And I said, Sarah can do this. And, I know Sarah and I know what she's capable of. And she's not some, super audio visual, been trained, for 10 years, on, network television. She's, a fairly, normal person like I am in terms of those capabilities. And if she can do it, well, I can do it too. And that's how I got started thinking about doing the podcast that I eventually launched, Why It Works, which I've actually had her as a guest on it, which was awesome, sort of closing the circle there. But I've had so many great experiences and met so many wonderful people. Mario McCracken, Dr. David Lieberman, great people from my work like Michael Orth, Gail Smith McCarthy, Mike Kennedy. Just had so many great experiences meeting people, and this was all made possible because of the podcast, which was all made possible because of Sarah. So, with that, I'll end the longest intro ever to the Charisma Corner. And with no further ado, here we go, Charisma Corner with my good friend and source of much inspiration, Sarah Elkins. Hello, this is Joe Kwon on Charisma Corner with my good friend, Sarah Elkins. Sarah, I met through LinkedIn and also through a great conference that she does, NLV. And it'd be great, Sarah, if you could just introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure, Joe. Thanks for having me on this. I'm so excited to be chatting with you. I'm Sarah Elkins, and I am a storytelling coach, but I also am a Gallup certified strengths coach. And I found that my niche is really helping remote teams better communicate. And I love to start off with going to a retreat with these remote teams, getting them face to face, and then sustaining that kind of culture shift using strengths and storytelling and that aspect of communication to sustain those relationships that you build face to face when you're going to be remote for most of the year.
Great. That sounds excellent, Sarah. So, our question on Charisma Corner today is, when was a time where um, there was someone you met who was super duper charismatic, and what was that like? Or in the alternative, when was a time where someone was just totally the opposite of charismatic because something they said or did just, blew the whole thing up?
Well, what's interesting is that I find that charisma is really a subjective thing, where one person might describe someone as charismatic, another might not.
Hmm.
And what I realize is that it's not so much whether or not they're charismatic. I think it has more to do with um, how you are seeing them. If you're turned off by them, that doesn't mean they're not charismatic. It just means that their charisma doesn't appeal to you. So I'm immediately transported to a customer service training that I was required to go to when I worked for a local library.
Hmm.
And I was just circulation staff. I was a part-time employee. I was there while my kids were little. It was a way for me to get health benefits while my husband was self-employed. So we were all required to either go to the morning 3-hour workshop or the afternoon 3-hour workshop, which would be a repeat of the morning one. And I went to the morning one. And the guy walked into the room. He's super tall. And I don't know if you've read those statistics, but tall people have a tendency to be seen as more charismatic.
Sure.
They statistically are more successful in business. So when he walked in, when I first saw him, he smiled. He seemed like he was going to do a good job. And then he walked out of the room while we all sat down, which it makes sense. I do that sometimes when I'm doing a keynote or a workshop. I'll walk out to let people settle in.
Hmm.
When he walked back into the room, he strutted in a way that I could see his legs before I saw the rest of his body. And when he smiled, it was like this weird, almost it was creepy. It was almost a creepy smile where his lips were like stuck to his teeth in
Uh-huh.
that weird smile, like he's gonna eat somebody for breakfast, like a
Nice
shark
to
almost.
eat you. I mean, meet you.
and and then the whole beginning of his workshop was talking about himself.
Mm.
And the most bizarre part was when he was at in the front of a U, and we had probably 50 people in the room, and there was somebody sitting at the U in the power seat in that back corner of the U shape of all the
Hmm.
tables put together,
Hmm.
and her phone rang. And she leaned down, and my friends and I just assumed that she was going to turn off the phone, but
Uh-huh.
she ended up taking the call. And she's in this training with 50 other people. And she's leaning down, like next to the table, under the table, whispering. And the guy has this perfect opportunity what customer service looks like in a difficult circumstance, right? But
Uh-huh.
instead, he stood in front of her, crossed his arms, and started tapping his toe. And when she looked up at him, startled, and said, "I have to go," and hung up the phone, he looked down at her and he said, "It's fine. We'll wait." Like she was a fourth
Wow.
grader. and, and that was when he lost everything for me. Um,
Mm.
he had the potential to be so charismatic, but
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
of his response to his audience, the arrogance of it, the self importance of it, he just lost me and probably roughly half the room. And what
Wow.
the reason I started this with the whole subjective discussion about charisma is that when we left that room, I realized half the people in the room loved what he had to say, and the other half were totally disgusted by his attitude.
Sarah, can you repeat what you said, like half the people in the room, because you
Oh,
started glitching out?
yes.
Yep, I can edit that.
So what I realized what I realized was that half the people in the room needed to hear his message about leaving your crap at the door in order to have a good day, which wasn't customer service. It was more about leaving your crap at the door and have a good day. But half the audience really needed to hear those messages and just loved what he had to say. And the other half of his audience was totally polarized and didn't find one bit of a nugget out of those 3 hours.
Wow, I love that story. And just to rewind to make sure I heard properly, this guy was supposed to be training you on customer service.
Yes.
That is just brilliant.
It was so discouraging to me. And I know as a workshop facilitator, as a trainer, as a keynote speaker, that I'm not going to reach every single person in my audience. There's always going to be somebody that my message doesn't resonate with.
Sure.
But if you're losing half your audience, there's
Mhm.
something wrong with how you're demonstrating your own charisma.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is a fantastic story, Sarah. I think there's so many things we can learn. Sometimes you learn about like what not to do. You
Yes,
learn in that negative way as well. So thank you so much for sharing that story on Charisma Corner.
my pleasure. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that story on Charisma Corner. You're the first person to go for the question, what's a time where someone really blew their charisma? Mostly people seem to like the questions about, when were they charismatic or when did they witness charisma? So I really appreciate you going there and sharing an experience where someone really blew a chance to be charismatic. And I just love how ironic it was that, this was a customer service person who I probably would want to be on the other end of the line where I call in for a problem, because they sounded like they were just really all about themselves and not about the customer, and certainly not about the people like yourself and that woman who took the phone call, which was a little rude to take it properly, but that's not the point. To really give the best experience to all of you in the room in a gracious manner. A couple things really stood out to me, a couple principles about your story. And the first one was when you talked about how people who are attractive, who are tall, and it's, they have scientific data to show this, they really have a charisma or a popularity or an earning potential advantage, no matter the way you look at it. So they've done studies about people's faces, beauty being defined as, being symmetrical, and those people somehow being promoted or earning more. Something about quarterbacks. I know they've done a study. I'm sure there's plenty of studies about, people's heights in organizations and how that might affect their promotion and earning status. So I don't think most people will dispute that that actually happens, but what's really going on there? And from a charisma perspective, what I would call it is that's simulated charisma, right? So what happens is when people look or sound or have certain attributes which our brains typically use as a shortcut to associate with something, that gives them a certain preliminary kind of advantage. It doesn't mean they're always going to do better, right? But it makes it a little bit easier from them without having done anything themselves other than just looking how they look or being born into the situation they were born. Now, the thing is, I call it simulated charisma because you still have to deliver the goods. Now, it's a really great 1-2 punch if you have that marker of charisma or power or wealth and you have what it takes to back it up. Then it's like you're unstoppable. But you can't do it just with the simulated version. You also have to bring the substance. And the fact that you don't have the simulated version or the simulated part doesn't mean that you should just give up and there's no way you can do better or catch up with someone who maybe was blessed to be born into a better situation than you are. When you have the goods, even though people might not give you an easy road in, when you can figure out how to get in the door and show what you have, then the charisma takes over and then the sky's the limit for you, because that's really the principle. That's really the driver of success, not that simulated portion. And I call that real charisma, bona fide charisma. So if you have the bona fides, you can go a long way. It's important to understand that without the simulated, it can be kind of harder to get there. And that's something you should be aware of and consider, and not really take it personally. It's just kind of a thing that our brains do. But I think that's really sort of instructive and great about the example you shared. The other thing, just real quickly, that I thought was quite interesting was when you said maybe half of the people thought it was great and needed to hear that message about checking everything at the door and turning your phones off, and then half of people were like really turned off, including yourself, and disgusted by the way this guy handled the situation. And I think that illuminates a key charisma principle, which is that it's in that energy between people, right? So you can't take a person in a room, in a room full of people and say he will always be exactly the same level of charisma to everyone else. It's all in the energy that's generated between him and that specific other individual, right? So the same behavior that to one person might seem like, wow, it's amazing, I can't believe this guy is doing this. He put her in her place, he shut her down. Thank goodness, I wish more people had the guts to do it. Versus other people are, equally valid to think, oh, that is just so self-important, graceless, and rude. There was probably, 50 better ways he could have handled that without making this woman feel so horrible. Who knows what she was going through? Maybe she really had to take that call. So thank you, Sarah, so much for sharing that story, picking that topic, and being a guest on Charisma Corner. Thank you. If curiosity is the key, how do we get there, right? It's one thing to say curiosity is important, but what if you're just not feeling curious, right? Are you dead in the water? Are you just done? Is there nothing you can do? Because sometimes we talk about theory and we say, be happy, be this, be that. But if you're not feeling it, it can be kind of difficult to achieve that state. So is there anything we can do to improve our ability to be curious? Well, lucky for us, as we have it, there is a charisma kata, which I call fill the jar, which will help you become more curious or help sort of energize or spark your curiosity. So charisma katas, just to remind folks real quick, they're practices you can use mental or relational practices where you practice doing them over and over and over again. The point not being sort of a thing that you deploy like a specific tool, but the point being that you do it so often that after a while you just kind of know how to do that normally. Just like how you know how to drive or ride a bike or construct a sentence. You don't have to think about it. It just kind of happens because you've done it so many times before. But the way we get there is through practicing a defined, limited set of motions or directions over and over again, like the multiplications table, where all of a sudden you don't have to think about it anymore. It just comes out naturally. And that's really what you need for charisma. You need to be natural. Charisma needs to flow. It can't be something where you're like, okay, paragraph A, section 1, in this situation, I have to respond to this with... It's not going to work. It'll never work. You'll be too slow. You'll be too fake. People will have already left the room while you're still trying to recall what the next thing is that you have to do. So that's why charisma katas are really helpful. So this charisma kata is called fill the jar. So what does it mean to fill the jar, and how can this help us spark more curiosity? Now, this charisma kata was inspired by something I learned in, could have been one of these Dale Carnegie. I'm a self-professed self-help book junkie, but it could have been one of these Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people type self-help motivational type kind of book, where someone told a story about a salesman and how he was able to become the leading salesperson at his organization, where he had a jar and he started out the jar empty, and then he had a bowl of marbles, and he would not quit until he filled the jar every day with all the marbles. And filling the jar would be something like making a sales call or doing something that he needed to do to further his sales process. And it's really powerful. Like, it seems simple and almost silly, but it's really powerful. That I truly believe having some physical correlate or some physical metaphor for what's going on is so powerful and so helpful to us as human beings, versus just saying, I gotta do 15, or I gotta do 2 more than I did the other day. The fact that he's actually able to physically pick up a marble, move it from here to here, and then see the progress as the jar fills up, super powerful and super effective. And it's the same kind of concept where people talk about checklists and checking things off. It's that same principle of having something concrete and being able to show the progress, and that how that really drives our behavior. So for charisma kata number 4 or number 5? I think it's charisma kata number 4, fill the jar. The number's not important, but for fill the jar, here's what you're going to do to spark curiosity. So you're in front of someone, you're meeting them, for the first time, or maybe not the first time, but you are just bored out of your mind. It's like this person seems to you to be the driest, most boring, obvious person in the world. So first thing you're going to do is stop that, right? Just stop that assumption that you know everything about them. So that's step 1. Because if you don't get past step 1, you're done, right? So you have to have a more open mind and just say, okay, I'm not really feeling it now, but you know what? Maybe there's something more to this. I'm going to be open and I'm going to give this a chance. So that's step 1. Have an open mind. Step 2. What I want you to do is think about each new piece of information you learn from this person, no matter how big, no matter how small, right? It could be, what did you have for lunch? It could be, do you have any special, anniversaries or birthdays coming up? Where are you going on vacation next? It could be anything. What's your favorite show that you're watching on, that you're binge watching now, right? Every piece of information that you don't know about them, this is novel information, that's going to be a marble, right? So what I want you to do is think of yourself in your mind having a virtual marble jar here, and you're gonna just ask questions, have conversation. And when I say ask questions, I never mean interrogate, right? It's not like question 1, question 2, question 3. You're going into a normal flow of conversation, but you're curious about the person you're asking. Hey, what about this? And that leads to another question. So again, it's not about creating a list or doing something artificial. It's about genuine interaction, always, always for charisma. So you ask a question. So you say, what are you watching, these days? And they might say, well, I'm watching this show called The King on Netflix. So here you go. You take one marble, you move it over, and now your virtual jar has one marble. Now, where do you go from here? Maybe you don't know what The King is about. And you ask, well, what's The King about? Which king is it? And they tell you. You take another marble, you move it over. Now, the great thing about this technique is it works no matter what you know. So maybe you know all about The King. Maybe you were the director or you acted in it. You can still ask plenty of other questions like, well, what did you think of the show? Or after seeing it, what's the next show you think you might want to watch? And they say, well, I'm really getting into sort of these, historical documentaries and I want to watch so-and-so. Take another marble, move it over. And what you're going to see is as you fill that jar, this person or this interaction, which you previously thought was just dead on arrival, right? Like just not interesting at all of a sudden is going to become alive and become more interesting. And the more marbles you've put into that jar, the more curious you're going to become. It has a momentum or an inertia of its own. And remember what we learned earlier in the episode, the more curious you are about them, they're going to become more curious about you. And watch out, maybe some questions are going to start coming back to you. Like, what did you think about the show? And now you're going to be giving your opinion. And all of a sudden, you're in this wonderful flow, back and forth, asking questions. And it's the curiosity that really triggered that. It's the curiosity that enabled it. But in order to do that, step 1, you have to just go away with this I know it all. You have to have an open mind, and you have to give things a chance and understand that there's something interesting in it for both of you. And step 2, you have to collect those marbles by learning a new novel thing about the person, taking it, putting it in the jar, and repeating until the jar is so full the marbles are just falling out. And that's when you're having a really amazing, charismatic interaction. So if you do that, I think you'll be shocked at how this boring person or this boring situation can actually be one of the most interesting conversations you've had all week, all month, maybe all year. Thank you so much for watching Charisma Chronicles, Episode 4, The Curiosity Connection. I hope to see you on social media. Feel free to connect with me there. And take a look in the description. There's lots of great materials and additional ways to find out more about this topic and other topics that I share about. Please subscribe if you enjoy these videos and click the bell so you'll be notified. And more episodes coming your way. Really enjoying this, hoping you're getting as much out of this as I am. So see you very soon for episode 5 of the Charisma Chronicles. Thank you.